Just last month, I met a software engineer in Berlin named Lucas. He was practically glowing, showing me this countdown app on his phone. It was down to just 22 days.
Wow.
Yeah. He'd spent 3 years building a life there, mastering the complex grammar, paying his taxes, volunteering at a local shelter. To him, those 22 days were the absolute final hurdle.
The finish line for getting his German passport under that turbo naturalization law.
Exactly. He had already picked out the suit he was going to wear to the ceremony, but then the atmosphere in the Bundestag just shifted. Almost overnight, that 3-year dream vanished.
And it's not like he changed, right?
Yeah.
His contributions didn't change.
Nothing changed on his end. But the rules of the game did. The new government under Friedrich Merz didn't just tweak the policy, they effectively dismantled it. Suddenly, Lucas wasn't 22 days away, he was 2 years away.
2 years. That's a huge psychological blow.
A huge blow. The turbo was replaced by a hard break, mandating a 5-year minimum stay, and it doesn't matter how well you've integrated or how many German boxes you've checked.
So it feels less like a policy change and more like a door being slammed and bolted?
That's the perfect way to put it. And at the same time, you see the borders tightening. Countries like Georgia and Moldova are labeled safe almost instantly.
Which is a mechanism to turn away asylum seekers before they even get a foot in the door.
Right. It is just such a stark, cold pivot for a nation that, until very recently, was seen as the most welcoming harbor in Europe. So what changed?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Is this a rational response to a housing and public service crisis? Or is it a calculated political maneuver to, appease a rising tide of domestic anger? To understand why Germany is suddenly pulling up the drawbridge, we have to look at the dramatic legislative shift that just took place this December.
It is a phenomenal shift. And the speed, as you said, is what's so striking. For decades, Germany leaned into this identity of being a welcoming society, the famous Willkommenskultur.
Right.
But maybe that identity was always a bit aspirational. This sudden hard break, it signals that the aspiration has just run headlong into a very, very difficult reality.
Absolutely. So what we need to figure out today is why this seismic pivot happened. Our mission here is to really analyze this December legislative shift under Chancellor Merz. Is this change just a rational response to these overwhelming logistical and social crises? Housing shortages, paralyzed public services, institutional strain?
Or is it something more political? A calculated maneuver responding to domestic anger, which then connects to Germany's evolving global strategic posture?
That's it. We need to figure out if this is a necessary structural correction or if we're witnessing the end of a long-held political ideal.
That's the core tension we need to unpack. Because this isn't just about minor legislative tweaks. This is about a fundamental redefinition of who gets to be chairman, what the expected time commitment is, and what the state's actual functional capacity is to handle this kind of rapid demographic change.
Okay, so let's start by looking at the specific policy that was just dismantled. Before the Merz government, the progressive ideal was in full swing.
It really was.
And it's important to remember, Germany, despite being a country of immigration, was historically very resistant to offering citizenship quickly or broadly. By the 2020s, something like 14% of the population, that's about 12 million people, still didn't have a German passport.
And only a tiny fraction of long-term residents were actually naturalizing. That historical resistance is crucial context. Germany's citizenship law was built on the principle of aequus sanguinis, the right of blood.
So if your parents weren't German, it was a long, hard road.
Incredibly difficult. And it often required you to renounce your original identity.
Yeah.
The whole goal of the former government's 2024 Modernization Act, the STAG, was to explicitly reverse that tradition.
To fix that statistic that so many long-term residents were, for all intents and purposes, disenfranchised.
Exactly.
So what were the basic liberalizations they introduced just before this big pivot?
Well, the first major step was just making the standard path shorter. They cut the standard residency period for naturalization from 8 years down to 5.
Which is already a significant change.
It's a huge acknowledgement that 8 years was just too long, especially for people who had stable lives, families, jobs. They also beefed up the conditional ius soli, the right of soil.
So children born in Germany.
Right. They now automatically get citizenship if just one parent has legally resided for 5 years, which is also down from the previous 8.
But the real attention grabber, the policy that people like Lucas were banking their lives on, was that controversial turbo path. Tell us about the specifics of that 3-year exception, because it really wasn't easy to qualify for.
Oh, no, not at all. The turbo path was specifically designed as an elite merit-based track. It was meant to reward people who showed an exceptional commitment to integration.
It wasn't just about being in the country for 3 years.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
You had to demonstrate German language skills at level C1.
And C1 that's basic professional fluency, right? Near native.
It's a very, very high bar. And crucially, you had to have secured a long-term livelihood. You had to prove you were self-sufficient and contributing through your taxes.
So it wasn't just language and a job, but there was also this qualitative measure of integration required, wasn't there?
Exactly. Beyond the hard metrics, the criteria included things like showing exceptional school or professional achievements or significant civic engagement.
Like volunteering or community leadership?
Precisely. The whole idea was to fast-track the best and the brightest, the most valuable and dedicated members of society on the grounds that they had already, outstandingly integrated.
And the 2024 Act also brought a massive symbolic and legal shift around dual citizenship. Why was Germany so restrictive on that for so long?
That restriction, the obligation to opt, was deeply painful for immigrant communities for decades. For example, Turkish nationals whose parents came as guest workers were forced, often as young adults, to choose.
Choose between their German identity and their heritage.
Yes, a choice between Germany and Turkey. And this caused immense friction and often just made people put off naturalizing indefinitely. They didn't want to make that final binding choice.
So the old right of blood idea was effectively enforced through this policy of a forced choice, which just alienated generations of people.
That's a perfect summary. The 2024 law fixed this directly. It moved Germany fully into a modern, pluralistic acceptance of multiple nationalities. It unconditionally terminated the obligation to opt.
So you could be German and something else, no questions asked.
Yes. And that was probably the single most important symbolic and legal change, especially for the Turkish community. It finally legitimized their dual identities.
And speaking of long-term contributions, there was also a really profound symbolic gesture built into that law for the original guest workers, the Gastarbeiter.
Yes. And that was vital. It was a recognition of their lifetime of contributions. For older guest workers who came in the 60s and 70s, the requirements were dramatically eased.
How so?
They only needed to show fundamental oral German proficiency, a much lower standard than C1, and they were completely exempt from the citizenship exam.
It was an acknowledgement that, their decades of labor and just being there had fulfilled the integration requirement, regardless of what some tests said.
Precisely.
So with all these changes, the 5-year standard, dual citizenship, the turbo path, the demand must have just exploded.
It was explosive. It showed how deeply people wanted to formalize their commitment to Germany. Naturalization surged to a record 292,020 in 2024.
That's a nearly 50% increase over 2023.
A massive jump. And of course, this volume created immense bureaucratic pressure, but it also proved the policies were working. They stimulated the very demand they were designed to address.
And who is benefiting most?
The data shows the leading nationalities were Syrian, Turkish, Iraqi, Russian, and Afghan applicants. Many of them were taking advantage of the new dual citizenship rules and the shorter residency times.
Okay, so now we hit the political wall. The Merz reversal, specifically the Sixth Amendment of 2025. You said the target was surgical. What exactly did Merz's new government terminate?
The core target was the accelerated process. The 3-year turbo path for outstanding integration, the one Lucas was counting on, is gone. Terminated.
And what was the official rationale they gave?
The rationale is framed entirely around stability. They argue that a sufficiently long period of prior residence is essential to ensure sustainable integration into life in Germany.
They believe 3 years just isn't enough time for real long-term cohesion.
That's their argument.
But the state still allows for some 3-year exceptions, right? It's just not for that meritocratic integration anymore.
That's right. Eligibility after 3 years is now strictly limited to spouses of German citizens. And they have to have been married for at least 2 years and lived in Germany for 3.
So it's a marital exception, not a meritocratic one.
Exactly. It effectively shuts the door on highly skilled, highly integrated individuals like Lucas, who might be single, but are professionally indispensable.
This termination is so dramatic, but, as you noted, the Merz government kept the other big liberalizations in place.
They did.
So that raises a critical question. If the government wants to attract and retain highly skilled people, doesn't killing the turbo path send a really discouraging message? That Germany doesn't value meritocratic speed?
That is the fundamental tension in their strategy, and it's a powerful challenge.
Right.
The government's defense is that they didn't reverse dual citizenship, or the 5-year standard.
Okay.
They'll argue that a 5-year path is still globally competitive for skilled migration, and the really crucial benefit dual citizenship is still on the table. Their argument is that they're protecting the integrity of the system.
The integrity of the system.
Yes. If the 3-year rule is seen by the existing population as a logistical shortcut that leads to social strain, then in their view, the benefit of speed is outweighed by the cost of losing internal social cohesion. They chose stability and internal trust over the speed of acquisition.
The policy shock is clear, but why did this hard break appeal politically? I mean, even to people who, on paper, you'd think would support fast-track integration.
Well, to understand the deep appeal of Merz's reversal, we have to look past the political headlines and see what was happening on the ground. There was this pervasive sense of structural failure in German integration.
A disconnect between the ideal and the reality.
A profound disconnect. The argument for the hard break is based on this belief that integration, when it's done right, is a cultural and bureaucratic process that takes years, not months, and any attempt to rush it just caused a crisis in national cohesion.
Let's use the story of Elena in Essen to frame this social cohesion argument. She was a volunteer, a fierce advocate for the fast-track laws initially.
Right, she was a true believer at first.
But her views shifted. She described witnessing a clinical erosion of her neighborhood's spirit. What did she mean by that?
Elena's experience illustrates a core critique of the turbo path. When the process was rushed to 3 years, the deep incentive for cultural exchange just seemed to vanish.
So people were just focused on the paperwork.
She felt that new residents, knowing their clock was short, focused purely on ticking administrative boxes, get the C1 exam, get the job contract, rather than truly engaging with neighborhood life, learning local customs, or investing in the long-term community fabric.
She used this really powerful phrase, calling the system a vending machine for citizenship.
And that perception is absolutely devastating for social trust. When citizenship is seen as a quick logistical transaction rather than the foundation for community, institutional trust starts to break down.
What was the result she was seeing?
Elena felt the result was the rapid formation of social silos. Pockets of the city where parallel cultures and languages became the norm. New citizens were integrated into Germany administratively, but not into the German social fabric.
I can imagine the psychological impact of that. For a long-term resident like Elena, who's watched generations of immigrants struggle to integrate, seeing others get full citizenship in 3 years just by focusing on the metrics, it must feel like the rules are being cheapened.
And that leads to resentment. Exactly. So the move back to 5 years, in this context, is framed not as a punitive measure, but as a desperate attempt to repair a social fabric that was tearing.
It forces a minimum cooling off and absorption period.
It does. It acknowledges a hard political and sociological truth. You can't manufacture national cohesion quickly through administrative shortcuts. The state has to show that citizenship requires a genuine, sustained investment.
That brings us to the pragmatic and economic critique, the idea that the system was just being overwhelmed. Let's look at Samir, the engineer in Munich.
Nice.
He is the picture of a meritocratic immigrant, C1 German, pays high taxes. Yet, surprisingly, he supported the stricter laws. Why? What was his argument?
Samir's critique is focused entirely on institutional strain. He didn't oppose immigration. He opposed overwhelming the core functions of the state that he admired.
He saw the functional integrity of the Western system he had moved for, the high quality of life, the efficient administration being crushed by what he called demographic pressure.
That's it exactly.
Can you give us some concrete examples of what he was seeing?
Well, he talked about the paralysis of city infrastructure. He had to wait 8 months for a simple building permit, a process that should take weeks because the local authorities were just swamped.
8 months.
And more critically, he saw the strain on public services directly impacting his own family. Overwhelmed schools meant larger class sizes, fewer resources, which he felt directly compromised his children's education. He migrated for a high-functioning society, and he was watching it deteriorate in real time.
And he also felt the 3-year law kind of devalued his own years of hard work.
He did. He felt he'd achieved his C1 German and professional success through sustained effort. The quick 3-year path, in his view, turned citizenship into a logistical shortcut, and that undermined the whole merit principle he believed in.
His logic is surprisingly pragmatic.
It's startlingly pragmatic. His point is, if the system's capacity, the administration, the infrastructure, the schools, is crushed by sheer volume and speed, then the very societal standards that attracted skilled migrants like him in the first place will just cease to exist.
That shifts the entire framework. So implementing stricter gates isn't about exclusion, but about maintaining the functional, high-standard Western social system.
Exactly. It's a pragmatic necessity argument. If the welfare state can't adequately house, educate, and care for everyone, the entire social contract becomes unstable.
And this domestic focus is echoed by conservative voices outside Germany, too.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the comments from Hungarian Minister Lazar, who claimed Merz himself admitted this was causing irreversible damage.
What did he say exactly?
Lazar claimed that Chancellor Merz privately acknowledged that the rapid migration policy had caused irreversible damage to Germany's welfare state. The argument is stark. The formation of parallel societies doesn't just drain money, it consumes the strength and nerves of the population and public servants.
Which ultimately weakens the national economy and makes Germany less competitive.
For these critics, the hard brake is a vital step to stabilize the core functions of the state itself.
If we dive deeper into this idea of institutional strain, the educational system seems to be the most critical and chronic failure point.
It really is. Germany has become a super diverse society. 29% of the population has a migration background, but the school system is fundamentally struggling to keep up.
And this isn't a new problem, is it?
No, the struggle is systemic and predates the recent influx, but the pace of change has just intensified it. The issue first really came into sharp focus back in the early 2000s after the OECD's PISA study.
The PISA results, that was a huge shock to Germany's self-image as a high-performing, meritocratic educational powerhouse, wasn't it?
A massive shock.
Yeah.
PISA measures student performance globally, and it revealed this terrifying correlation. Student success in Germany was far too closely linked to socioeconomic background and migration background.
There was a huge achievement gap.
A significant gap. But the initial public debate often focused on blaming the students. For supposedly weak German language skills, rather than questioning the system's own failure to adapt.
So the system was quick to fault the students, rather than looking in the mirror and acknowledging its own structural inadequacy.
Precisely. And beyond just a lack of resources, there is systemic institutional discrimination, particularly through what's called tracking.
This is where they stream students into different educational paths, vocational versus academic, very early on.
Yes, and children of immigrant origin are often disproportionately placed in the lower track courses, which severely limits their educational and career opportunities before they're even teenagers.
That early tracking, often around age 10 or 12, can basically determine a person's entire professional life. If there's bias in that process, the implications are just vast.
They are career defining. If you're put on the lower vocational track, your access to higher education and thus high-skill employment is dramatically curtailed. And this is compounded by segregation.
The segregation data is really jarring.
It's alarming. In Germany's major cities, studies show that around 70% of migrant children attend elementary schools, where children with a migration background are the majority.
70%.
And contrast that with only 17% for children without a migration background. This creates schools with these extremely high concentrations of complex needs, which often impairs learning for everyone.
And even when students are performing well, there's the persistence of teacher bias affecting grades and expectations. It's a double disadvantage.
Empirical studies confirm this. You see examples where students with Turkish names like Murat are graded worse than students named Max, even when their performance on a test is objectively identical.
That is staggering.
Other research shows teachers just generally hold lower expectations for students of Turkish origin, even when their motivation and cognitive skills are similar to their non-immigrant peers. This subconscious bias acts as a soft ceiling on their aspirations.
And that brings us back to the crucial issue of language, which is often framed as a conflict rather than a resource.
Right. Mastering German is absolutely key, but there's a persistent linguistic conflict due to what scholars call the monolingual habitus of the German system.
The system has a monolingual self-image, even though the country is multilingual.
Exactly. So the system privileges European languages taught in schools, English, French, Spanish, over the heritage languages spoken by large immigrant communities like Turkish, Arabic, or Russian.
Which is completely counterintuitive in a globalized world.
It's entirely counterintuitive. It creates an obvious systemic disadvantage. And this huge structural failure in education is a massive driver of the sense that the system is broken, which, made the Merz heartbreak so politically appealing.
So we've established the hard break is a response to these deep, visible structural failures. But this domestic recalibration is also happening alongside and influencing a wider strategic shift. We're seeing Germany transition from a foreign policy based on this kind of utopian idealism to one based on what's being called sovereign realism.
And this is where the internal and external concerns align perfectly. The feeling that the state lost control internally directly informs the desire to regain control externally and strategically.
The loss of sovereignty at the border mirrored the loss of sovereignty over internal systems.
Exactly.
To frame this, let's go back to Lucas, the software engineer. His view on the shift is critical here. He watched his progressive dream disappear, but he also felt a somber sense of relief. How do you explain that?
Lucas's personal evolution really mirrors the ideological shift of the nation. He grew up embracing the Will Cummins culture, but he came to realize that open-ended progressive idealism had ended because the state lost its primary defense mechanism.
The ability to say no at the border.
Exactly. He saw the state's actions designating countries safe, tightening enforcement, not as a betrayal, but as a necessary strategic realignment.
A defense of Western civilizational standards, as he put it, that were being traded away for an unsustainable dream.
And that sentiment provides the ideological foundation for the Merz chancellorship. He came into office with three very clear, announced focus areas: tackling migration, revitalizing the stagnating economy, and strengthening national defense.
These priorities show a government focused squarely on internal consolidation and external capability. It's a full rejection of the idea that moral posturing can replace strategic strength.
Absolutely.
And on the economy, the need for revitalization is urgent. The German economy has been stagnating. What are the specific tools Merz is deploying?
The agenda is aggressive and very pro-business. It includes significant business tax cuts to spur investment. There are massive state-backed investments planned in key sectors like digitization, renewables, and, crucially, chip manufacturing.
Trying to regain that robust economic functionality.
And securing affordable energy.
Yeah.
It's all about halting the trend of deindustrialization.
And on migration, the immediate border sovereignty measures were swift and symbolic. They essentially undid a foundational piece of the Merkel era.
They were very direct. The Interior Minister explicitly revoked a 2015 verbal instruction that had allowed undocumented entry on humanitarian grounds. The goal now is to enforce the core EU rule. You seek asylum in the first EU country you enter.
And that's combined with faster processing and more deportations.
A clear effort to assert control over who enters and, crucially, who stays.
This internal shift is mirrored by a complete overhaul of foreign policy. The previous government operated under wertebasiert Außenpolitik, values-based foreign policy. Why did that come under such intense criticism?
That idealistic approach was rooted in this post-Cold War idea that moral consistency should guide foreign relations, often overriding national interests. It was criticized as moral posturing and suffering from severe conceptual confusion.
It sounded good, but wasn't strategically effective.
Right. And it led to these clear diplomatic contradictions. For example, the government would lecture China on human rights, with the foreign minister even calling President Xi a dictator, while Germany maintained massive economic dependencies on Beijing. It's an incoherent position.
And the feminist foreign policy ran into similar problems.
Exactly. It rejected realpolitik security narratives, but then the government was forced by reality to send large-scale arms deliveries to Ukraine and Israel. The idealism just couldn't hold up.
So Merz represents a clear return to strategic realism.
A cold, clear-eyed analysis of power. He explicitly warns businesses against deep dependence on China. He speaks openly of an emerging axis of autocracies, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, as fundamentally opposed to Western interests.
A huge departure from the old hope that trade would transform these regimes.
And that realism has tangible military commitments, which is a profound shift in post-war German identity.
Right, creating the strongest European army.
That's the rhetoric. He's even willing to discuss previously taboo subjects like nuclear sharing with France and the UK. And he secured a massive $500 billion defense fund, bypassing the national debt brake rule to meet the NATO 2% GDP target.
That signals that military strength is now seen as the foundation of effective diplomacy.
It is. And this whole strategic pivot is best encapsulated by Germany's historical relationship with Russia, which was built on that flawed assumption of Wandel durch Handelchange through trade.
The idea that economic ties make conflict less likely.
Yes, the liberal interdependence theory. But critics argue this thinking is completely out of kilter with Russian thinking, especially under Putin.
How so?
Russia prioritizes national sovereignty and sees global relations as a zero-sum game. For them, economic tools like Nord Stream 2 are instruments of geopolitical influence designed to make allies like Ukraine and Western Europe vulnerable.
So Germany thought it was building a partnership, but Russia saw it as an exploitable dependency.
Precisely. Merz's pivot recognizes that Germany has to manage these tensions from a position of strength and protect its values, not hope for a quick reconciliation.
Okay, so Merz has the right analysis, the realism, but the question is, does he have the sovereignty to act decisively on it? The political environment in Germany is so fragmented right now.
And that is the core vulnerability of his chancellorship. This is why the policies can often feel like half measures. Merz is operating with a significant sovereignty deficit.
A weak coalition, a tiny parliamentary majority of just 52%.
He simply lacks the domestic political capital to implement the kind of truly transformative, potentially painful policies that sovereign realism would demand.
The main constraint isn't even his coalition partners. It's the relentless rise of the AfD, polling as high as 27%.
Exactly. The AfD's success acts as this existential constraint on the mainstream government. Every policy, especially on migration, has to be calculated defensively. Governance becomes a defensive reaction to stop voters from flocking to the far right.
What does that look like in practice, a truly sovereign action versus what Merz can actually do?
A truly sovereign action might be immediate large-scale deportations, unilaterally declaring a pause on asylum applications. Merz, constrained, can only implement legalistic tweaks. Revoking an old instruction, speeding up processing, terminating the turbo path. They're incremental measures.
The result is what you could call sovereignty theater.
That's a great term for it. He understands the strategy, the realism is there, but he lacks the domestic political capacity, the sovereignty to act decisively.
He's in a kind of domestic political prison.
He is. And the structural problems are too deep to be fixed by conventional political means under these constraints. So his policies become highly symbolic gestures designed to show intent without risking the collapse of his government.
This entire pivot from open-door idealism to this restrictive sovereign realism is really underpinned by a fierce ideological conflict about the very nature of Western progressive ideals. So before we conclude, we need a conceptual deep dive into the language that's driving this political shift, particularly the conservative critique of what they call woke ideology.
It's important to first define the worldview Merz is embracing, which is sovereigntism. At its root, it's an ideology supporting the political independence of a nation.
The idea of taking back control.
Exactly. And that can mean control from external bodies like the EU, or crucially, control from what they see as internal subversive minority groups that are eroding national identity.
And for these movements, the border isn't just a line on a map.
No, for right-wing sovereigntists like the AfD, the border is primarily a filter protecting the sovereign people from undesired new members. It's a vital defense mechanism.
Okay, so let's look at the opposition, the ideology that drove the previous government's idealism, which conservatives so often label as woke. It's a catch-all term, but how do they define its core tenets?
Well, the conservative critique defines woke as an extreme, progressive, identity-based belief system. It's seen as a broad cultural framework that includes things like critical race theory, critical legal studies, and intersectionality.
So it's seen as a radicalized successor to traditional liberalism, moving from reform to transformation.
That's the argument. From the conservative perspective, the central ideological tenet is the belief that society is fundamentally split into these immutable categories of oppressor and oppressed groups.
And that's defined not just by class, but by race, gender, sexual identity.
Right. And this division, they argue, is backed by an invisible power structure, the hegemony. The key, from their point of view, is the application of Marxist power dynamics, expanded beyond just economics to the entire cultural space.
So the focus shifts from economic equality to a kind of equity based on cultural and identity markers.
Exactly. And the critics argue the goal isn't just legal equality under the liberal framework, but a radical transformation of society. The goal is to destroy Western civilization and the hegemony.
Which leads to some extremely strong descriptions of the behavior associated with this from the conservative side.
Very strong. Wokeism is described by his critics as moral posturing about the elevation of sensitivity over truth. It's accused of fostering the insincere fabrication of victims and victimhood.
And what's the ultimate political critique?
The ultimate critique is that the purpose of all this cultural behavior is strategic. It's about acquiring power and gaining undeserved social standing, often through manufactured outrage. It's positioned by Merz's ideological allies as an existential threat to a rational, meritocratic Western society, which then justifies the need for this sovereign pivot.
So when we synthesize this entire German pivot, what we are really witnessing is a complex movement away from values-based idealism and accelerated integration
Toward a policy of sovereign realism and internal consolidation. It's a profound, reactive, strategic shift.
And this whole movement is a direct response to these perceived structural failures we've been talking about.
The tearing of the social fabric that Elena saw, the institutional overload that Samir lamented, and the economic stagnation that threatens Germany's global standing.
And all of this is intensely magnified by the pressure of domestic political fragmentation and the need to neutralize the political threat from the rise of the AfD.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Merz government has essentially recognized that it cannot pursue an ambitious, outward-looking foreign policy based on values, the idealism of the previous era, until it fixes the internal structural fractures that are compromising its ability to function.
To educate its children, to provide basic public services.
The hard brake on turbo-naturalization, the tightening of borders, the pivot to defense spending, they are all interconnected measures of internal triage. They are designed to stabilize the ship by reestablishing a clear boundary between state capacity and demand.
If you look at the evidence, the overwhelmed schools, the collapsing neighborhood trust, the bureaucratic paralysis, it really does suggest a powerful realization on the part of Merz's government. That Germany's most fundamental strategic vulnerability is not external, not military threats from Russia or economic dependence on China, but the fragility of its own internal social contract.
I think that's right. The shift to a 5-year minimum stay isn't just a bureaucratic change. It's an attempt to buy time. Time for the strained welfare state and the educational system to regain their institutional capacity and solidify the social fabric before accepting more massive demographic change.
Which leads to the final question we have to mull over.
If the hard brake on integration buys the state time, what is the realistic timeline for realizing that institutional capacity? And what happens if, 5 years from now, the educational system still hasn't caught up, the housing crisis persists, and the next German government is faced with the exact same structural failures all over again, only with the added political pressure of a population that's tired of waiting for the promised stability?